This is the last section of the conic section. Now we're going to complete the square to figure out what shape it is. So we're going to walk you through and we're going to do some completing the square. So this is in Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 we did completing square, and I know some of you guys forgot, so I'm going to walk you through on how to complete the square. So the first step is then to label the equation. So as we have a quadratic equation, I'm going to have is then a underneath it for the coefficient of x. The coefficient for the 6x is going to become a b, and then this minus 7 will become a c right there. And make sure it's always equal to 0 because we will bring things over to the other side of the equal sign. Okay? So then step number 2 is to bring c to the other side of the equal sign. So in our case, minus 7 is going to be brought to the other side by adding it since it's negative 7. So then I have is x squared plus 6x equals 7. Now, if you do not have, or if you have a coefficient in front of x squared in completing the square, you're actually going to have to divide everything by that coefficient because you always have to have a coefficient of 1 when you do completing the square. So this is the stuff that you did in Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 when we were looking for the roots of the quadratic equation. So when we do binomial factoring, it's fun and easy, but it doesn't always work. So if it doesn't always work, the second best is then to do the quadratic formula or completing the square. Because both the quadratic and completing the square will actually guarantee you an answer. So the bad part of the completing the square is that I have to have a coefficient of 1. Whereas the quadratic formula, it doesn't matter what number I have as far as the coefficient, because I can always substitute those numbers into the quadratic formula. Okay? So just a little brush up and review on that part. So let's go into step number 3. So step number 3 is we're going to take half a b and we're going to square it on both sides. So in our case, 6 is the b, half of 6 is 3. We're going to square it on both sides, so it becomes 3 squared on this side. And we're also going to square it on the other side of the equal sign. Now, just again, review. On this right here, this x squared plus 6x, that was the original equation that we had up here. The 3 squared is something that you just created. So because you created this, to legally do this in algebra, whatever you do on one side of the equal sign, you have to do exactly the same on the other side of the equal sign. So if you add 3 squared, you have to add 3 squared to the other side of the equal sign. So this is then become a legal step right here where I can actually bring a number in as long as I have it on the other side of the equal sign as well. Okay? So we still have is equals 7 plus 3 squared on the side. So now we're going to go into step number 4, which is then converting it into a squared form. So because this right here, as I mentioned before, the a has to be a 1, this will always be x right here. Okay? Now this sign right here, as I noted right here, will always be taken from the b sign. So if b is positive, then you're going to put a plus. If b is a negative, you're going to put a minus instead. Okay? And then this number right here will always be the half of b that we took. And then we're going to square it. So it looks something like this, where this is the previous screen that I had right here. So I copied the x right here, as I mentioned, copied the sign from the b, so in this case it was plus 6x, so I'm going to put a plus right there. And on this right here, notice I did not take a 3 squared out and put a 9 right here, because if I did 9, I would have to take the square root of it to get to here. So on this step right here, just leave it as parentheses squared, whatever that half of b is. Okay, so that way it's easy to just put it inside the parentheses right here. I put a square right here, equals, and then I have to simplify this side right here. So it's 7 plus 9, which is 16 right there. Okay? So the next step then is to square root both sides. So if I square root a squared, that's going to cancel it out. If I square root of 16, I'm going to have 2 answers. I'm going to have a positive 4 and also a negative 4. And again, this right here is because when we look for the roots, there are 2 answers on the roots. That's why there's a plus and a minus 4. Okay? The last step then is to solve for x. So we're going to bring 3 over to the other side of the equal sign, and we're going to have 2 answers. X equals 1 and x equals negative 7. Okay? So that was the completing the square, just a review from Algebra 1 and Algebra 2. Now, for this section that we do for the conic section, we're not going to take a negative right here when we do the square root. We only are going to use the positive answers for this. Okay? So now let's go ahead and now talk about what we're doing for this section. So similar to that, we're going to do some completing the square, then we're going to go into the next mode, which is the stuff that we learned in 8.1, 8.2, and 8.3. We're going to have to figure out what shape it is. It's either going to be a parabola, ellipse, or hyperbola, and then from there we're going to graph it out. Okay? So the first step right here is to isolate or to group all the same variables together. So in this case, the y squared and the 2y is going to be grouped together. The x right here, this is the only x I have, so we're going to have it stand by itself. And then the 13, we're going to bring it to the other side of the equal sign. Okay? So this is what it looks like, parentheses, y squared plus 2y, close parentheses, plus, and then negative 6x, again, is by itself, and then 13 was brought to the other side. Now, this is where anytime you have a square right here, you're going to go ahead and do that completing of the squared idea. This right here does not have a squared, so you're going to leave this negative 6x. Only the one that has a square and something next to it like a b, right? Then that's going to be the one that you're going to do completing the square. So take half of 2, which is 1, right? And 1 squared. So this is what it looks like. So 2, half of that is 1, 1 squared. As long as I do it on the other side of the equal sign, we're good, because that's legal right there. Okay? So again, this right here is positive times negative. I just simplified that and cleaned it up and got a negative 6 right there. And so again, this is going to stand alone for the moment because there's nothing we can do with this one. So now let's go into squared form right here. So we're going to copy the y, we're going to copy the sign from the b, so in this case plus 2y, so we're going to copy the plus, and we're going to take that half of b number, so it's going to be plus 1 squared, copy the 6x, and then equals, and on this side we're going to simplify this, so it's negative 13 plus 1, which gives us negative 12, and then we're going to stop right here and determine which of the three shape it is. So it's either a parabola, an ellipse, or a hyperbola. So from the characteristics, we know that this only has a squared. This does not have a squared. So it cannot be an ellipse or hyperbola. It has to be a parabola. So in a parabola, it says that I need to have all the x's on one side of the equal sign and y to the other side of the equal sign. So we're going to bring the 6x over to the other side by adding 6x on both sides. So we have a 6x minus 12. Now, if you remember in parabola, we also had in front of the squared is that 1 over 4p part of it. Okay? If you don't remember, you may have to go back to that video on 8.1 or your notes on 8.1. So make sure you go back. It's that front right there has to be 1 over 4p. Because I have a 6 in here, I can factor out a 6. Then if I factor out a 6, I can bring the 6 over to the other side to create that fraction. Because remember, we want that fraction in front right here. So if I divide it out, I get 1 over 6, parentheses, y plus 1 squared equals x minus 2. So from here, then we're finding is the vertex and also the p. Okay? So next screen, remember the vertex is always found in the parentheses. Okay, so that's your h and k's, right? So h is off of the x, and then the k is off of the y right here, and it's opposite sign. So in our case, the vertex is going to be 2, positive 2, and this is going to be negative 1 right there. So the p is found off of this right here. Now, most of the homework that we've done, the p was easy to find, but in this case, if it's 1 over 6, we're going to have to do some algebra. So we know that the form is going to be 1 over 4p, so you're going to set it equal to the 1 over 6, and you can always cross multiply and solve for it. So 1 times 6 gives us 6, 1 times 4p gives us 4p, right? And then you divide by 4 on both sides, and that's going to give us 3 over 2 as your p right there, okay? So you need the vertex and you need the p to be able to graph it out. Now, we also need to know, is this parabola right here going sideways or up and down? By looking at the equation, this is an x equals. So remember, if it's x equals, it's facing the x-axis, so it has to go sideways. And because this is positive, it's going to open up to the right-hand side right here. Okay? So let's go ahead and do that then. Let's go ahead and graph this out. Okay, so the vertex is at 2, so 1, 2, negative 1, so here's my vertex. I'm going to put a V right there. And my P, we said was 1.5, because it's 3 over 2, so it's 1.5, that's my P, and then going the opposite direction, 1.5. Remember, it's opening sideways, that's why I'm going sideways on my P right there, okay? And as we mentioned, the X right here is X equals a positive, so it's going to be opening to the right-hand side since it's positive right there, positive. So then the opposite end right here has to be is the directrix, right? Which we learned from 8.1 on the parabola. So that's going to be my graph right there, okay? So it's going to be a little lengthy on this problem because you have to complete the square first, do the mathematics or the algebra first. Once we get to the algebra, then we're going to graph this out part of it, okay? So let's try example 2. So example 2 is going to be 25 y squared minus 9x squared minus 50y minus 54x minus 281 equals 0. Okay, so same idea. We're going to group all the y's together. We're going to group all the x's together. So in this case, there's more, right, because there's an x squared and an x. So we're going to group those together, and we're going to bring the number to the other side of the equal sign. So here we go. I have this 25 y squared minus 50y in that one part of the parentheses, plus, and then the second parentheses I have is negative 9x squared minus 54x, and then equals 281. So now, I have a number in front of that y squared, and I also have a number in front of x squared. But remember, completing the square, we cannot have a number in front for the a. It has to be an a of 1. So because of that, we have to factor. So I can factor out a 25 in the first part of the parentheses, and I can factor out a negative 9 on the second part of the parentheses. So it looks something like this: 25 parentheses y squared minus 2y, and then negative 9 parentheses x squared plus 6x equals 281. Okay? Now from here we're going to do that completing the square. So we're going to take half of b and we're going to square it on both sides. So half of b, now this is also tricky, is this part right here. I'm going to take half of b right here, square it, right? That looks good. Take half of 6, square it on this side, that looks good. Now on this side is the tricky part. Because I have a coefficient right here, I have to include the coefficient, because remember, when you distribute this back, it should go back to this original form. And again, if I distribute 25 times 1 squared, that's something that was created. So I have to get rid of it on the other side. So it's 25 times 1 squared, got to get rid of it. And then negative 9 times 3 squared, have to get rid of it as well. Okay? So now we go into the squared form. So the squared forms, again, we're going to take the y variable, the sign from the b, so in this case it's going to be minus, and then half a b number right here, so in this 1. We're going to take the x, take the plus in this case, because that's the sign from the b, and take half a b, right, and square it. So this is what it looks like. It condenses down to 25 parentheses y minus 1 squared minus 9 parentheses x plus 3 squared equals 225. Now let's stop right here because we're almost done. Now we have to figure out is what shape is this. So looking at this, I know I have a squared and a squared, so it cannot be a parabola. So now I have two choices. It's either an ellipse or a hyperbola. So from the characteristics that we learned, this has to be a hyperbola because it's a minus. Okay? Now let's say you accidentally right here put the x's out in the front and factor out the x. You're going to have a negative 9 in the front. You cannot have a negative in the front, so you're going to have to bring it back to the other in the back side right here. So make sure you bring it to the back, and you know that's going to be a hyperbola. Okay? So also from the characteristics of a hyperbola, we know that this has to equal 1, so that means I have to divide by 225 on both parts of the x's and the y's. So then from here, this turns into 1, and then I'm going to be able to simplify 25 and 225 and 9 and 225. It should go in evenly. So from there, I'm going to have is y minus 1 squared over 9, and then minus still x plus 3 squared over 25 equals 1. Now this is the final form right here. We're done with the algebra right here. So from here, this is what we take from here is the graphing portion, which we did in this 8.3. Okay? So from the center, we found its opposite side. So this is our center right there. We also know the x-axis is the square root of 25 is 5. The square root of y is 9. And then from there, I'm able to graph it out. So let's go ahead and graph it out. So we're going to take this. And the center is negative 3. Oops. Let me erase this. And we need the grid. Okay, so negative 3, so it's 1, 2, 3, positive 1. So here's my center. I'm going to put a C for center. And then for the x-axis, it's 5 to the left and right. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's one of the vertex. And then the other end, 1, 2, and I'm going to run out of room, so I'm going to go 3, 4, 5. And then we have to do 3 on the y. So it's 1, 2, 3, and 3 on the 1, 2, 3, somewhere up here. And then we're going to create our little imaginary box, right? The rectangle. Something like this. And then we have to do the asymptotes that goes through the center. The vertical asymptote or slant asymptote that goes through the center. So make sure it goes through the center. Goes through the center. And then we draw the hyperbola. So remember, this first part is where the hyperbola is. So in our case, the variable is y, so we're going to draw the hyperbola on y. So again, this is the vertex of that parabola part of it, and use the width of this right here. So we're going to take the width, we're going to use the width, and do the same thing on the top part. We won't be able to see it on the screen, but you're going to have to do it on both top and bottom right there. Okay? So that's what we're going to do. It's going to take a little bit of work right there, so pay attention to completing the square, and make sure then you also go back to the notes on the characteristics of a parabola, ellipse, and also the hyperbola.